Director, US and Americas Program, and Dean, Queen Elizabeth II Academy, Chatham House, UK. And the session is being moderated by Rakesh Mohan, President and Distinguished Fellow, the Center for Social and Economic Progress, India. Over to you, Mr. Mohan.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to Samir Saran, the T20, the ORF for organizing all this amazing conference. I assume that since the last session took half an hour extra, Rajat, we should have 1 hour extra because the subject is much bigger here. But let me just. Yes, so let me not waste time and go straight forward. I think everyone has been introduced, so I won't need to introduce the panelists. The subject is the issue is a simple one: trust, integrity, resilience, rethinking globalization. So compared to the last subject, obviously we need double the time, right? So they had 1.5 hours, so we should have 3. So let me just start off very briefly to give, I think, in my mind, the context to the session in terms of trust, integrity, resilience, globalization. Since Rajat started the trend of talking about economic history, let me start with that. So the feature of, in some sense, the global economy since the end of World War II has been a continuous process of economic integration of the world. Long period of time, 77 years. Starting with the Bretton Woods conference, of course, the founding of the United Nations, also decolonization, which was a big feature of that. And in some sense, the emergence of the US, there is no one from the US here, so I can say this. You're from the US? Well, we'll regard you as British. So the emergence of the US as top dog, and Europe is a deputy dog in the global environment. So that system lasted for a long time in terms of global economic governance. United Nations, of course, was doing the political governance. However, until 1990, neither the IMF nor the WTO nor the World Bank were global institutions because they excluded the whole communist world until 1990. It's only after 1990 that they really did become global institutions, except for Cuba and North Korea, I think. So the point here is that after 1990, they became global institutions, and so there was this tradition of trust in the whole global system. Then, of course, until around 2015 or thereabouts. I say 2015 because I left the IMF board in 2015, so things sort of went downwards after that. And of course, also, Indian inflation went up after I left the Reserve Bank in 2009, and also growth slowed down after that. So the big things that have happened in some sense over the last decade is really China impact. Of course, China's entry with the WTO in 2000 or whenever it was has really, 2002, has really made a huge difference to the balance in the global economy. And the way I put it is that what has happened in the last 20, 25 years is for the first time after more than 200 years that the fulcrum of the global economy is moving from the mid-Atlantic to somewhere between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. And the West doesn't like that. They don't like this fulcrum moving from the mid-Atlantic to somewhere in the Indo-Pacific. And according to some projections, 2/3 of incremental growth, Albert, is that right? 2/3 of incremental growth will come from Asia in the next 20 to 30 years. The West doesn't like that. And the US doesn't like China becoming competitor, particularly in technology. Particularly in technology. They don't like it. So the consequence is a huge disruption in some sense, breakdown of trust in the governance of multi-development banks, IMF, etc. And to put that in focus, since I was in the IMF, today, that is 2023, the existing governance and quotas in the IMF are about 15 years out of date, in the sense that they are based on relative GDPs, etc., on other parts of the formula from 2008, because that reform was finally done 2015. The next quota review is this year. I hope I'm wrong, but unlikely to happen. And basically, since the founding of the IMF and the World Bank, the quota reviews were taking place almost regularly, every 5 years, as put down in their charter, until the emerging markets and developing economies, GDPs started rising. And so this is where this, you might think, why am I talking about all this with the subject at hand? This is the issue of trust in the global economy, in the governance, that unless these kind of things are addressed, tackled, is going to be a problem. Then, of course, further breakdown took place with the Ukraine war. We have a representative from Russia, so it's unusual these days, but welcome, and I hope you can enlighten us. So the current situation, therefore, is that there is some kind of increasing breakdown of economic integration, the US-China tension, US-Russia tension, India-China tension. I don't know how BRICS meets these days. And also G20, I'll start with Mr. Chinoy, that given this huge increase in tensions within G20 members, that hadn't happened until about 3 or 4 years ago, actually. That in G20 you didn't have these kind of huge differences which you have now. So how that if we believe that the G20 objective ought to be sort of at least restoring or making sure that these political disruptions do not disrupt the global economy. How do we restore trust in the global institutions? How do we reduce the tensions? Since you are the head of G20, Sujan, we expect you'll have all the answers for the G20.
Well, thank you, Rakesh. All these words that you mentioned are very potent, and for me personally, they are good points of inflection. You began by claiming that the age of globalization set in after the Second World War. To me, with a slightly sort of deeper analysis of history, I would say that the real age of globalization began in the age of discovery and in the age of colonization. For me, it is apparent that the 4 industrial revolutions have had very different impacts on what we refer to as globalization, or these very potent words such as trust, integrity, resilience, and rethinking globalization. The first industrial revolution for me, which gave rise to things like the locomotive and the steamship, were actually instruments that furthered globalization, but in a very colonial context. We must remember that India too was part of that terrain, which was globalized, but as a colony. And the second industrial revolution, which gave rise to the manufacturing sector, in fact furthered this process of exploitation of resources, especially by the colonialists from their colonial possessions and dominions. The third industrial revolution gave some hope because it came with a different kind of manufacturing, low cost. It came with the advent of the information age and technology that allowed the traditional engines of global economic growth to shift from the West, from the United States and Europe towards Asia. And I think it was making for a level playing field. But I'm afraid the advent of the fourth industrial revolution with the kind of emerging technologies that it is bringing in, quantum physics, artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth, is actually once again creating the grounds for inequality and possible unequal growth, a possible exploitation of a very, very grim and different and serious kind. For me, therefore, there are essentially 6 T factors which are available as points of friction in all geographies today around the world. There is the T of trade, which we see is at the center and heart of conflict today and competition. But it's difficult to control because trade is fungible. Trade is not always in the hands of government. It is led by the private sector, by entrepreneurs, by traders, industrialists, which is why we see in an era of major power contestation that US-China trade, US-Japan trade, US-India trade continues to grow, but China-India trade, China-US trade, China-Australia trade, China-Japan trade also continues to grow. Technology, the second T, is also at the heart of contestation, but easier to control because technology is usually high-end when it comes to export restrictions and sanctions, etc., and therefore governments are better able to legislate the exports of technologies. The third T is the T of territorial contestation, which is also at the heart of what is the current discourse in Europe as well as in the Indo-Pacific. The fourth T is that of terrorism, because this is something that fundamentally questions peace and progress everywhere today. No peace and progress, no stability, you cannot have economic growth. The fifth T is that of tenets and narratives, which is again at the heart of major power contestation. Whose narrative, whose system of governance, economic, political, social, cultural, is superior? Is it the democratic model? Is it the liberal trading order? Is it the state-led capitalism of the type practiced by China? And this goes on. The sixth factor also, which is common to all geographies, is trust or the utter lack of it. Today, therefore, I would say that it is time to focus on making existing multilateral institutions more resilient. They are weakened, they are underperforming, but it is difficult to do without them as well. We have seen how the United Nations has proved ineffective and impotent in the face of major situations around the world. It has not been reformed for a very long time. In fact, the only time it was touched was in 1965 when the ECOSOC had passed a resolution 4 years earlier in 1961. It took another 4 years to actually implement that decision to expand the non-permanent category from 6 to 10, taking the total number of Security Council members from 11 to 15. And we haven't seen any change since then. When you look at the Bretton Woods institutions, the international financial institutions, or the MDBs, you see a similar problem there. In fact, I know that you are an expert in these matters, but I do want to point out that as far as the IMF is concerned, it accounts only for around $950 billion worth of special drawing rights, which is only 1% of the global economy. And in that, you see that only 40%, roughly, is actually special drawing rights controlled by the developed countries, and about 60% is actually indirectly controlled through what you call new arrangements, bilateral arrangements to borrow, etc. So it is lopsided from the very beginning. Any change requires 85% of the vote. If the United States of America, a single country, has 17.5% of voting rights there, you can realize that there is a veto in place. When you look at the World Bank, for instance, you cannot do anything without, for instance, congressional approval. So I think we are at a stage where we have to not only try and reinvigorate the existing system, but also to fundamentally reform it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the somewhat sobering tea party that you give us. Before I come to you, Fyodor, I just want to make a comment on the globalization. Actually, the first real globalization was around sort of late 19th century, from 1870 to the First World War. And what worries me, and including your sobering thoughts, is that after the first globalization, free trade, in fact, in those days, there was also relatively free movement of people at that time. What happened? And it's also, it was also a period when the top dog moved from UK to the US. But it took 2 world wars and closure of the global economy for that to be solved. And I hope that what is going forward now will not involve 2 world wars to go forward. So Fyodor, since I guess in your terminology, it's what's a special military operation, not a war. But since I've ended with the 2 world wars, let me ask you that in this current situation of all the tension we have in the world, because of the Russia-Ukraine situation, how do you think, and we won't go into that, so just to make sure we don't get embroiled in that issue, but only in the context that this is causing also disruption in the global economy, geopolitical. And I'm not blaming anyone right now, okay, because we don't want to get into that. But how would you think this can be resolved? How can the G20 help in going forward without, blaming people, without going into names, and just in terms of looking forward, that this is now an objective situation, how do we go forward for more cooperation in the world?
Rakesh, thank you very much for this question. I think that you have touched the right surface to analyze what is going on and what will happen with globalization further. I think that example of crisis, of conflict between Russia and the United States and Russia and NATO, which is reflected in the war in Ukraine, but it's only the part of the situation, is showing us that right now the main factor which is deforming globalization and destroying benefits which we have got from globalizations is the factor of guns which are prevailing butter. And the critical question, will it last during next decades or not? I would like to remind you what we have started with in Ukraine. In 2013, it was a matter of discussion and matter of negotiations, could be a matter of negotiations, which way the Ukrainian economy will follow, the EU association or membership in Eurasian Union. The issue could be resolved in several months of negotiations. It's very, very distant from what we're having now. And now what we see that globalization is deforming significantly by this conflict. And it's not only Russia and Ukraine which are suffering from this situation, but European Union is suffering a lot. I would like to remind you that in 2013, Russia had about 400 billion of trade turnover with the EU. And right now, the engagement, the role of trade with Russia in European Union reduced from 10% to less than 2%. And European companies lost a lot in terms of their competitiveness, especially industrial companies, because they have been cut off from Russia's oil and gas, which was the cheapest for them. And they have also lost Russian market, which they benefited a lot. Russia lost a lot because of technological cooperation, FDI coming from European Union. Of course, it lost, not completely, but significantly, European markets. And what is happening right now is that in this situation, the United States could significantly benefit from this crisis because they have investment flows coming from Europe to the United States. They are making European companies less competitive than American companies. And Russia has been pushed not only towards China, like here everybody is saying, but to the gray zone of global economy, which is also globalized. Okay, but what will be the next with China? Would the United States try to use their competition and growing confrontation with China to deform globalization more? I would like to remind you that, of course, the level of trade interdependence between China and the United States is still very high, and Jake Sullivan is telling us about de-risking, not decoupling. The mutual trade turnover is about 700 billion of US dollars. But with European Union, China is having about 940 billion of US dollars in trade turnover. And it grew significantly during last years. The same with India. Mutual trade between India and China has mounted 135 billion of trade turnover. And also there are additional figures on Hong Kong. But would the United States be ready to sacrifice this benefits coming to other players to the new crisis? This could be the critical question.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Actually, what you pointed out raises a larger question in terms of how we think about this. That during the Cold War period, which lasted a long time, 40 years or thereabouts, the huge difference was that the communist or socialist economies were totally separate from the others. So there was very little economic integration between the socialist world and the rest. The difference now is exactly what you've just said, is that there's total integration. And therefore you can't do what you did in the Cold War, and which makes life in the future more complicated. So Vera Helena, should I say Vera or Vera Helena? Vera. Since you're away from all of us, right? Down there somewhere in Brazil, yes. You have a much more objective view of the world. So hope you can give us some solutions.
A little bit. Okay, let's face reality. We are facing a multi-crisis world. And my question is, can this world survive without multilateral organizations? Fantastic question. Yes, and the world is showing that despite the crisis in the north, the big north, we, the countries of the south, the global south, India, Brazil, and so on, well, we have to survive, right? And we need some rules on what's going on. And we need rules of trade, more or less. And sorry, but we are living in the world that we are having, we're doing trade with renminbi, with dollars, and we are inventing new kind of monetary systems. So the point is what to do. And I think that about after 30 years in WTO, I can say that, look, sorry for the lawyers, but can we envisage a world without treaties, without hard law? Can we sit down with the ones, even with the big countries, and to discuss some kind of guidelines to keep the system moving? Why I'm saying this? Because in case of WTO, and the same for the IMF and World Bank, the rules are old. We have to make new rules, right? And forget about treaties. Nobody's going to negotiate anything anymore. So my point is, can we just imagine guidelines to know, like we need to talk about trade and environment, trade and digital world. These are our real world. And we cannot wait for new rounds of negotiation and so on. So the point is, go to the more soft way, forget about treaty, forget about the whole hard system, And look what's going on the area of trade. Trade is a big issue with investment, with environment, with even the human rights and so on. All these things are being negotiated in preferential arrangements. And do you know what's funny thing? You have the rules for the American model and the European model, but you are looking for different models. We can discuss a trade agreement with India, and we are doing this in other countries, more or less using the old rules, but really improving. So the system can continue. So I answered the point of the question, that is, do we need multilateral organizations to organize the world? I can say yes, but we can live without them for a while till the big problems are solved or not solved, but we can invent new things and move on. You know, with the digital world, with the digital currency, we can have a new kind of financial system, and we can more or less live without the big countries. What is the worst scenario is that the big countries impose on us, the South countries, the global South, that we choose one side of the other. That's the point. That we are not going to, why? Because we are trading with the whole world, we are getting influence and investment and so on for the big players, the global players. We cannot be forced to choose one side or the other. That's the point, the view of the global South. So we can survive without the multilateral organization for a while.
Thank you, Vera. So that's a very good point on not having to choose either side. As you know, India, since independence, have been experts at not choosing sides. So maybe a suggestion, Sujan, from Vera is that in the India presidency, we should teach the rest, so we should teach the South, our country, South countries, to how to not be forced to one side. No, so I was just commenting, and maybe after we'll come back on that. The point you make actually is very interesting substantively, which is that what's happening today in the absence of legal agreements in the WTO, is that you have a spaghetti bowl of trade arrangements. Right. I always forget the new name of NAFTA, US, Mexico, Canada, something or the other, right? USMCA. So with the USMCA there, European Union there, ASEAN +3, RCEP, and so on. So you do, and of course a huge number of bilateral trade arrangements, and and 150? 350. And you have along with, and now actually it's not just trade arrangements, the investment arrangements as well. So your suggestion that, look, we don't need the multilateral organizations, life is going on. And again, if I can, since we are friends, I'll keep picking on him. Sujan, that you talked about control. So what you're saying actually, you can't control, so forget it, right? The trade, despite all the tensions, as pointed out Fyodor, trade is booming between US and China, between India and China, etc. So it doesn't matter. Right? And same technology you said we can control. You know, the history of the world is you can't control technology. That is, you can't control the movement of thinking, movement of knowledge from one country. Then it'll be stolen. Which is really what ought to happen. The countries behind should steal from countries who are ahead, whether they like it or not. So, having said all that, Leslie, do you agree with that? The only way forward is forget about the multilaterals. They're not going to improve. Your countries, that is UK, Europe, in particular, because they're the ones who lose their shares. Actually, US won't in the governance. Forget about them because they're never going to agree. Let's go on with our business. Do you agree with that?
Of course I don't agree, but let me start by saying a few things. First of all, it is an honor to be here. And it's a pleasure, too. And I am delighted that India is leading the G20. I think it's one of the most significant things that's happening in the world this year. And I think that India's leadership is absolutely vital. and critical. And there's nothing better than coming through the airports this year and seeing the G20 right out front. It is a sign to the world that India is taking leadership and cooperation and globalism seriously, and I applaud and encourage it. And I should say that the country of my passport, I carry one passport, the United States, has just announced that India will have, Prime Minister Modi will have a state visit in June, only the third state visit by the Biden administration. So I also applaud the strong ties between the United States and India. I should also say that my father was Indian. He was born in India. He lived in India. He left India in 1953, and he became, many years later, an American citizen. So I also have roots in India.
1853 or 1753?
1953. He left India in 1953. He was born in 1935. So I also have family roots and heritage in India. I live in London. My husband is British. So I feel a citizen of many places in a deeper sense, but I carry one passport. And I say that because I think it's important, there's a term I want to put on the table which I think is incredibly important, and it's certainly important for India in its leadership, because India has a very rich and very extraordinary history as a new nation, as a civilization, as a very diverse country. That empathy is incredibly important, and empathy not only for the global south and developing countries, but also empathy for the United States. And let me start with the first point. The reason that we're seeing, to speak to the question of the panel, one of the most fundamental reasons that we're seeing a rethinking of globalization and a pushback against multilateralism is because I would argue that in a certain quite profound but also material sense, the global south exists inside of almost all countries, and it certainly exists inside of the United States. What we've seen is rising levels of inequality in the United States since 1993, with many, many people within the we talk about, when we're in India, we talk about the United States as this one thing that's, sort of monolithic and powerful, less powerful relatively in economic terms than it used to be. But the reality in the United States is that there have been many, many people who have lost from globalization. And those voices have become extremely concentrated. They've been mobilized through the Republican Party, and they've had a very powerful voice and impact on US policy. And that's being reflected in America's desire and intention to rethink the rules through which it engages bilaterally, multilaterally, and regionally, especially on economic issues. So it's not simply that the United States is concerned about losing out to Asia. It's that the United States faces very powerful and legitimate political constraints that emanate largely from at home. So a lot of what's going on in the West is about what's going on at home, in the same way that much of what's going on in much of the world is about what's going at home. So I think it's really important that we're cautious when we start, treating countries like monoliths. These countries are comprised of very, very diverse populations with radically unequal living circumstances. I only have to look, I live in a very nice neighborhood, in a very nice house, and I only have to look right across the street at the council block to know the inequalities that exist in the United Kingdom. So rethinking and renegotiating globalization, the so-called new Washington consensus that was articulated, I think, in the Atlantic Monthly in this edition, is fundamentally about distributional issues and distributional politics inside of countries. And we do have to take that incredibly seriously as we think about how to navigate the multilateral framework. Throwing out the multilateral framework would be deeply harmful. It is absolutely essential that there is at least engagement through contest over the rules of the road. Even if the rules need to change, there need to be forums for our countries and also civil society and corporate actors to come together and to argue about the rules, to engage, to avoid extreme diplomatic pitfalls. The extreme crisis of the pandemic didn't need to be as devastatingly negative in its consequences as it was, but we lacked the multilateral frameworks to really address that. So I would say quite the reverse. The lessons of the pandemic, certainly the interwar lessons, certainly the post-war lessons, and the lessons of the current period are that we need to invest more than ever in rethinking multilateralism and renegotiating it so that it works for all countries, but also so that it works for all people within countries. And so empathy for the diversity and the inequality that exists also within the West, I think, is critical. Second point I want to make really importantly and powerfully, and I think we do have to address it, is that it will not be possible. I mean, India knows this better than perhaps any other nation because it's been at the core of India's articulation of its values on the global stage. It will not be possible for countries to cooperate in a meaningful way unless we respect sovereignty, the UN Charter. It is absolutely vital that we don't use force to alter borders, and past historical records and the allegation of hypocrisy is extremely important, but it cannot be used as an excuse for states to use force to alter borders. It not only upends the most fundamental norm in the international system and has devastating consequences for the states immediately involved, it also divides the world and makes efforts to cooperate between the North and the South, between the West and the East, extremely difficult, and that's what we've seen since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This has to be dealt with if we want to have broader multilateral cooperation across multiple fronts, because the concern that's coming out of developing countries that the North must focus on debt, it must focus on climate, it must invest, is absolutely right and essential. At the same time, respect for sovereignty is the most fundamental norm in the international system, and we absolutely must embrace it.
Thank you for that defense of multilateralism. And as you know, given India's situation, we have been among the strongest votaries of multilateralism because we are not part of any other arrangements. So our view has always been for multilateralism, but the fact of the matter is that if there's a rebalancing of governance in particularly the economic institutions, that is the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, and then of course putting on the United Nations side, it has to give up the powers that were important post-World War II and modernize themselves today. What that means basically is that Europe, including the UK, lose their weight. US actually is somewhat underweight according to their GDP in global balance. So the only way that multilateralism, and we can vote for multilateralism, is if the Europeans, including the UK, agree to about halve their vote and governance power in these institutions. Otherwise, they're gone.
The question is, who is blocking multilateralism? Sorry, it's the United States and the fight with China. So that's it. And how about us? What are you going to do? Sorry, Russia is not the problem. It's the North problem, not the South. But sorry, the US is blocking multilateralism. So everybody is in favor of multilateralism. But in the time being, we have to move, right?
I think it's really important.
One second. No,
can I add one thing
to
that?
Yeah, one second. I just want, who are the organizers and who's the chief organizer here? The organizers have gone, so we'll have to take another 15 minutes.
Yeah, no, I'll just be really quickly on
Leslie
that.
and then Sujan.
I think it's really important to be very specific. First of all, I'll go back to my starting point premise. The United States is comprised of, what is it, does anybody know, 360 million, 370 million people, very, very different people.
By the way, there's no American
very different positions.
Interestingly, there is no American think tank present in this T20 mid-year summit.
Were they invited?
No,
Who was invited?
Amar doesn't count.
Well, I will say for the record, that I'm a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. So there you go. I wear many hats. It is true that I'm here in my capacity and through my role at Chatham House, but I am a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. It's really important to be very specific, I think. It's incredibly important because it's very hard, I think, to have an effective and productive conversation about where to move the needle, where to put pressure on the U.S., which is important in many situations, if it's not said in a concrete form, in a way that can be where states can engage and move forward on that issue. 10? 2 hands?
We have task force meetings, so
I know, but the point is
So
that the last panel took 2 hours.
Rakesh, let me just get in 4 quick points. You know, India not taking, in fact, I want to come back to the topic itself. India not taking sides does not mean that it cannot take a position. And issue-based alignment is something that India has practiced in the past. Whether it was in 1962, despite non-alignment, India seeking some relationship in the defense sector with the United States, or in 1971, similarly, having a treaty of friendship and cooperation with the Soviet Union. The second point is that information in this fourth industrial revolution is both explosively available, fungible, but it is also being tightly controlled. And I fear that the new digital era that is ahead of us with AI and quantum physics and all these restrictions and all is going to make for a new kind of colonization. The third point is that the current debate and conflict is about a rules-based international order, and there is absolutely no consensus on whose rules-based international order. That's at the heart of the matter between China and the United States. And my last point would be that the requirement for the T20, G20 for India is to see how to get existing multilateral institutions, however effeminate they might be, impotent they might be, to not only strengthen, but to...
It is totally wrong to say effeminate. You can say impotent, but
However,
not effeminate.
Sorry, I'm just using the English language.
No longer allowed.
I get the point. The point I'm trying to make is that to get these ineffective multilateral organizations to also be talking to the parallel institutions that have come up in a much more effective way. If we can achieve that, then India's G20 is likely to be more successful with everyone in the room, to go for low-hanging fruit, give everyone a chance to get away from the gridlock on the highways of international multilateralism, to get them actually seeing value in low-hanging fruit. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a nice positive point to stop on, particularly because I can see someone there who's getting extremely unhappy. And we can't have an organizer being unhappy. So, and I'm very sorry to all the students, to everyone, we couldn't have any questions, but it's his fault for not giving us time.
Thank you, anyway.
Always the fall guy. Anyway, thank you very much, Mr. Mohan. Lovely to have you here. May I request our panelists to please join for the family photograph?